the UPC obviously worked, and what I think people sometimes fail to recognize is that there were an awful lot of standard efforts that went on over that same period of time that did not succeed. And you don't need to go any further really than the general merchandise industry to see one of them. They started about the same time that a little bit before the ad hoc committee to develop a standard. They announced their standard a little bit before the announcement of UPC. It was the utilization of OCR, OCR-A, I think. I can never remember if it's A or B, which they announced about 2 months before we announced the UPC symbol. It led to us, by the way, changing the numeric version of the UPC that's under the barcode, which is actually printed in an OCR font. The reason for that was we wanted to be compatible. We said we could be compatible, except we used whatever one they didn't. So if they used A, we used B. They got no implementation of their effort, and by the mid-1980s, it was still grocery industry that was using UPC. At which point, a gentleman by the name of Roger Milligan led of Deering Milligan led an industry effort, which actually I think was quite influenced by his relationship with IBM, with the marketing Miller, I think it was. Who's your famous marketing? Not Zip.
No, the guy was
everybody.
Buck Rogers.
Yeah.
Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers. Really did a good job. Milligan was leading a group of textile manufacturers and retailers, and they were working on trying to get more American production, and so they had an effort crafted with pride in the USA. And Buck said, you know, that's good, but what you guys don't realize is that you have, by being locally produced, significant advantages in logistics over overseas producers if you only were to take advantage of them. And one of the things you really ought to do on that is to get into logistical efficiency, and your stuff isn't, you don't have a scanning application in general merchandise. And so he got Roger interested in developing one. Roger looked at the UPC effort, came to me, and asked advice, and I told him the story of how we'd done it in the grocery industry, and he decided he was going to do the same thing, and so he got Jack Shoemaker of Walmart. I was vice chairman of Walmart at that point to represent Walmart, and he and Jack put together a committee of manufacturers and retailers. I believe there were 10 of them, half manufacturers, half retailers. I actually wrote the charter of it, and it was very, very close to what we had for UPC. And this group met and ended up, would you believe, endorsing UPC. But that was 1985, 86. They lost maybe 15 years that it took them to recover from what turned out to be a bad standard to a good standard. So there are other efforts for standards, modular shipping containers, pallet, things like that have failed. time and time again. The efficient consumer response effort, I don't think has borne much fruit. As you look at those, and you look at UPC, what's the difference? And I don't think it's that the UPC opportunity was greater necessarily than some of these other opportunities. I think it was more the process by which the industry would made it happen that was somewhat unique, and it's been very hard to get that process replicated in other efforts. The first and foremost was the structure, the mandate, and the composition of the ad hoc committee. The top management, chairman, our presidents, the fact that the technical people were only advisors, they couldn't represent the individual companies. The fact that it was independent of any trade association influence after formation made a huge difference. And in trying to replicate it, you run up against the fact it's very hard to get 10 chief executive officers, top performing companies to sign on to do something like that. And there's also a tendency to put, what do general managers have to do with this? Isn't this really a technical issue? And what I think we find out is that there may be technical issues, but it's typically not the technical issues that whip you in the end. It's the general issues that whip you in the end, and you have to have people who are used to dealing with those sorts of issues very intimately involved in it. We had that group, and I don't know another example of any standard effort I've ever seen. And I've been involved in 2 or 3 others, including trying to get the European Airline Association to standardize on an automated ticket. But again, it gets bogged down if you assign this to middle management and technical people. A second critical factor, I think, is the concentration of the UPC effort in it's right from the initial stages on establishing the economic feasibility of the concept. Almost every effort that I've been involved with and familiar with seems to start with the hypothesis that it would be a good idea to do something, and then never revisits that particular premise. So all the effort and activity goes against, is it going to be square around, as opposed to, is this really a good idea to start with? People just aren't comfortable, and they feel that any questioning of the concept is either redundant, everybody knows it's a good idea, therefore we don't need to spend time and effort in trying to validate it, and consequently they don't get the feasibility out in front where it should be. And another reason why that's important is that there are almost inevitably going to be trade-offs as you develop a standard, and unless you have a really accurate understanding of the business case, you don't know how to make those trade-offs. In the UPC, there were literally dozens of trade-offs. Example, do we have to put the symbol on the bottom of the container or not? Huge difference in terms of the cost. You think of all the cans and bottles and things like that. That would have to have a separate adhesive adhesive symbol put on the bottom. But that depends then upon the operation of the business case. How important is it that we have it on the bottom versus the natural bottom as opposed to a side or some other location? The cost of developing the technology so it could read more than an inch or a quarter inch or whatever it might be above the flat surface. And until you are able to have those differences quantified to be able to make decisions, your chances of coming up with the optimal solution are very, very low. And so UPC, I think it turns out, it's hard to believe this perhaps, but it's fairly unique. And honestly, having done a very thorough job of developing a business case. And that was not easy to do because the ad hoc committee had to pay McKinsey to do it. And what are we doing messing around, trying to figure out whether scanning is a good idea or not? Let's just go do the symbol. Why are we spending the money? There was great criticism at the time. And fortunately, Gookin and the ad hoc saw the light and said, no, we're going to go through it this way. And that made a huge difference, I think, in the final success. Another thing I think that's important is that in the enthusiasm to take on new ideas, people often make the mistake of thinking that its acceptance is going to be universal. And they fail to recognize that there are affected parties almost inevitably in any sort of major change. And that some people are going to be against it. And that it is critically important that you anticipate dissent and that you also continuously syndicate your conclusions along the way, and so you can continue to build and expand upon a consensus that says this is all a good idea. The last thing in the world you want is towards the end of the day, somebody says, why are we doing this anyway? I mean, that's a question that should have been answered way back. And most every other effort, though, that I've ever been involved in, you find dissenters saying, gee, why is this a good idea when you're in the midst of implementation? And in the UPC effort, that was fortunately anticipated. We anticipated safety concerns. We anticipated possible consumer concerns. We set up a public policy committee before we had any problems with consumer issues. We set up a laser safety effort dealing with trade association, 2 or 3 trade associations in Washington, so that we were ahead of the curve in terms of where do we stand in terms of somebody saying, I'm blinded by a laser. And there must have been, perhaps a half a dozen issues, possible dissent and so forth, that we tried to deal with, anticipated, and fortunately were able to overcome. We still had to face difficulties. We still had a congressional, a Senate committee hearing on whether this wasn't prejudicial against small companies, and we had to testify that it was all right. We had anticipated, fortunately, that particular issue and had conducted a so-called small store study way back, in which we, at some expense, had a great deal of effort, did small stores, something like 50 small stores across the country, and did the case for small stores that we were sure worked in large stores, but we went through the process of researching its applicability. So when the problems came along, we were able to confidently testify as to what was going to happen in small stores. And we had gone to the Small Store Association people and had told them all about this. And so when the senators sent out questionnaires to small companies saying is it going to be good or bad, we got an overwhelmingly positive response from the companies. But that just didn't happen by accident, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those three things I think were critical. And there was also an intangible, and I don't know, it's hard to get your arms around it, but something about UPC turned people on. And every one of those, almost every one of the 10 ad hoc committee people, most of which I've kept in touch with over the years, time after time, I would talk to them after they'd retired and so forth, and all of them said, you know, as I look back what I did, the one thing that really sticks in my mind is that UPC effort. And it caught, somehow, it caught their fancy. And people just put aside what their normal positions and prejudices and so forth. We used to laugh about the fact that if somebody from ours came into a meeting, the ad hoc, and listened to the debate, they would almost inevitably, if asked to say who are the manufacturers and who are the retailers, they'd get it wrong, because it turned out in that group, the manufacturers always seemed to be more concerned about retailer issues, and the retailers always seemed to be individually seemed to be more concerned about the manufacturer issues. I mean, it was special, and so that was the final thing I think that separated this from many other efforts.